I know that start moving the questions along. And as Richard said, that's pretty much the way it happened. I'm sitting there on the other end going, boy, this is kind of weird. That all these things are happening, and as he described it, a lot, of course, I didn't know, but between he and myself, how it has just evolved, going along, and the directions things have taken. I know those of us who were here for the conference, and we've talked about this various times over the last couple of days, and we're really quite pleased that everything has come together as it has. This is about this morning an exchange of ideas and just a conversation between us, between you, question and answer. As Richard said, we're all going to have differences of opinion. Even those of us within the conference, the original scheduled presenters, you probably gathered this by yourself already. I mean, there are divergences of opinion here, so no one is endorsing anybody else's views. We just want to talk, we want to answer, we want to listen to the question. And hopefully it'll stimulate questions in you, the questions you ask will stimulate us to think. I know that's happened to me already several times. I'll tell you. Yeah. I'll tell you what I've been really struck by between the work of both of you. And that is, you talk about being open and preconceptions, conceptions, so on and so forth. I was really struck yesterday with Dave's presentation. Again, I confess I'm an astronomy buff. I don't know much about precession, but it just seems to me, I do know patterns when I see them. I'm not blind. And I'm struck not only by the frequency and the depth of the patterns in both Richard's work and Dave, but what really kind of hit me was, as far as an analog, an earthly analog, that is word specific. The whole idea of Sidonia, Sidon, you're only going to find this in the Old Testament. This component of this pattern, and there were a few things that Dave said that I just had never really thought of. And when we talk about language, if you're an academic, you're taught certain rules of language. We're not going to poo-poo the rules of language because language has rules. It's like a computer program, a computer language. It makes communication possible. It's not just random and chaotic and disordered and so on and so forth. But I also think that this rubric is true, that it's sort of becoming self-mantra with me that the text can mean more than what it says at face value, and it can't mean less. To make it less means to make it meaningless. You strip away any sense of objectivity. As linguists, we're taught certain rules of etymology, we're taught rules of grammar, we're taught rules of syntax. And so if a linguist who was not open would come here and listen to Richard or Dave, and they're talking about sound similarities, word similarities, and they're not just incidental. Some of these are whole words, whole phrases, that kind of thing. An unopened linguist would say, well, this is just ridiculous. We need to see a linguistic history documented in text, all the way down to this. And I'm saying, well, I think you're requiring a little bit too much of the material. There's nothing wrong with a little intuition, because on the other side, if we accept this word relates to this word, we should be able to test that in other ways. So when we get to the Sidonia, I just think that linguists, academics are kind of like what Richard was saying with scientists. It's just so ingrained in you that you have to have not only just correlations, but almost like correlations for every point, every thought you think. It sort of requires the intuitions and correlations. And I think it does. I think it does take the spirit of wonder out of what we're doing. A couple weeks ago, I actually was listening to a sermon on Sunday morning. I was driving somewhere, and the guy made this exact point. As soon as you have everything down on your checklist, that you've got everything figured out, boy, doesn't this enterprise become boring. And it becomes boring to the enterprise. Not your enterprise. Think bigger. And I just agree with that. And so, from my perspective, I gave up worrying about my academic reputation the day that I decided to take the contents of ancient texts seriously. But these people were not idiots. They're not low IQ. They're not low thinkers. They had something to tell us. We ought to give them some credit. Yes, they might be speaking in terms of a language we don't understand. But hey, approach it as a linguist does, the grammar and all the rules and stuff like that. But the text can mean more. They can communicate in other words. I just don't want to reduce it to rubble and make it mean anything. So what I like to do, wondering what my own approach to all this is, especially with David's connections and his use of the Old Testament and some other things. What I want to see is, okay, here's the trail you're following. Here's the linguistic data that you're using. If we can be secure in what we're doing, with good rules within a discipline, practicing good methodology, to me that allows and opens the door for wondering what else they might have meant. That does not deny what the text says in terms of the rules of language, but that goes beyond it and actually correlates with it. To throw out another thought, something I said to Richard a couple of days ago. The other neat thing that I've sort of, as I've thought about this, again, I'm obviously relative to both these guys, I'm a newbie when it comes to this kind of thing. Even though I deal with the ancient world, we're taught again within the strict linguistic parameters. But it strikes me that if this is correct, the whole Cydonia thing, even if it's not extraterrestrial, it turns out to be some other, like it was us in some, pre-cataclysmic civilization or whatever. Whatever it turns out to be the source, this stuff screams design. And as a theist, of course, if you were here last night, I make no apologies for that. But as a theist, I would.
I can see the poster now. Heiser, this stuff screams.
No, but it does. I mean, within Christianity, there's an intellectual movement within Christianity called the intelligent design movement. Some of you have probably heard of that. And it's basically being fueled by Christian academics who teach it in all the big highbrow universities in the country and overseas as well. And the big thrust is, look, questions of evolution and all this stuff aside, and many Christians would accept that. At the very heart of this, even when you get down to what Michael Behe, who's a biochemist at Lehigh, calls Darwin's black box. A lot of what Darwin said in that era, when his ideas gained some steam, they didn't really know much about the cell. So he calls it Darwin's black box, and he says, look, even something, a unit that small, and the subunits within it, all the way down to its atomic structure, the term he uses is it's irreducible complexity that shows design. This can't happen by accident. And so I think within the Christian community, this ought to be, and I'm not going to claim it's going to be, I hope it's going to be, but maybe not anytime soon because of the association with Mars and some of this other stuff. But this ought to be something that the believing community, Jew or Christian or Muslim as well, ought to be interested in, because in my view, the only way you explain this kind of intricacy, this kind of design, is a design error. It's all back to Aristotle's unmovable or the uncaused cause, that every design needs a designer. The whole teleological argument in philosophy. Again, the Christian community would be a variance, or there would be different positions along the spectrum as far as some of the other stuff. Because David's problem is going to be, as he said yesterday, that a person who's Gnostic can listen to his presentation and go, yeah, right on, Dave. Okay, not perhaps paying attention or tuning out the fact that, hey, there were Christians and there were Gnostics in these early centuries. They were opponents, they had debates. There were reasons why there was a division between them. And there's a whole intellectual package in ancient texts, the church fathers you can go read to follow those debates. The Christian community needs to realize that Dave is not a Gnostic. Okay? And that's going to be his battle. So I just think that we need to recover, and this goes along with a little bit with what Guy said yesterday. We need to sort of go back to the early centuries, go back to the way they were thinking, try to recapture, as Richard said, David's doing, get inside their heads for what they were thinking and the modes that they were thinking in, because again, I know nothing about math, but I know this. To the ancient mind, math meant something. It wasn't just, oh, I got to take up a few hours a week learning this gobbledygook. I mean, to them, it was a sacred thing because it worked everywhere in the created world. It showed design. They were deliberate patterns. Well, I'm more of a translator and a nuts and bolts guy, so I'm not a programmer. I'm going to need, for me to have a chance to answer the question, I need to comprehend it better. So if you could give her the mic back, I'd like to just a little elaboration on what makes it be more specific.
What is your opinion on the usefulness of learning E prime as a way of thinking out of the box, and the usefulness of neuro-linguistic programming as a way to learn to think out of the box?
Boy, I know one person who is involved in that, and he is the extent of my experience with him. And in a nutshell, he's had limited results with it. I'd like to say there's a substitute for just good old fashioned rote memory discipline. And I'm not saying there isn't. I think it could help, but it is not a silver bullet. And that I'm not familiar with. I just have to. The other one, I'm not going to scold Richard for not being there either, because we've talked about this later on. There's really two ways that this can be approached. One is to get the believing community to put this thing, other life form, in the category of many other things that Scripture doesn't specifically tell us about, but that we know are real. Atomic structure, fission, microwaves. On one level, that's just a little skip. With some people, that's going to be, no pun intended, a quantum leap. But nevertheless, it is a legitimate recategorization of the issue. The other thing about linguistic support, this goes back to the idea that the text can mean more than what it says, but not less. If we take, again, just this idea of language and metaphor that was important to the ancients, the people who composed these texts, and if you're not familiar with Christian theology does not deny the human dimension of the authorship of Scripture. And I'll grant you, inspiration is sometimes presented as an event. People want to, God zaps the enemy dictator. That is not orthodox theology. If you've been taught that, you've been misled. You need to do some reading. But the idea that it's speaking in metaphor, on that level, I could say, yeah, there is textual support, and that's where this guy comes in. Because he's tapping into the language and metaphor, and then tying it back into the text, and again, in a patterned way, not in an XYZ alphabetic, subject, verb, object way, but it's taking the text and eliciting the metaphors that are there in the patterns. So I would say the believing community has two options there, regardless of what isn't point blank apparent. We just need to do a little thinking. I have a comment about this, the whole serpentine thing. I want to comment on that and use it as an example of the need to think more broadly. But then also this responsibility, the deliberate rejection of so much information. On the one hand, it's a good example of something that the believing community ought to think about, and is going to have to think about, if Richard and David are correct. Nergal, if they're correct that this is part of the important Sidonian imagery. Nergal was the god of hell. Okay. He's the god of the underworld in Sumerian Mesopotamian text. But now catch this. The connection between the two faces of Nergal and the two faces that David showed us on the cherubim in the temple. How do you mesh? How do you resolve that pattern? Okay, that's just something to think through, because you want consistency. You want to honor the data that there are these motifs, these patterns. Why does it show up here, and why does something that ostensibly looks like it belongs in the same pattern group show up in a diametrically oppositional place? I'm not going to say I have the answer to that, because quite honestly, this is just something I've learned here, okay, over the last few days. When there was to think in terms of the cherubim, it reminded me of something that Adrian Gilbert has in his book Signs in the Sky, when he talks about astrology, and again, trying to use that word in a neutral sense, because both Jews and Christians, at least in the early periods of church history, practiced a form of astrology. I know a guy who did his dissertation on zodiac mosaics in synagogues. Okay, it's there. They were very careful to avoid the prohibitions, certain prohibitions of Deuteronomy, and give glory to the God of heaven. And that was the key difference. But inherently, this whole system of knowledge that David is tapping into, they understood this. They understood this and had a meaning for them. So that's why I'm saying I think we need to recontextualize these sorts of things. And there's a reason why the image is used here, it's used over here. My guess would be that oftentimes when the Old Testament, when the Bible adopts pagan imagery, it's for either an apologetic or a polemic point. And I'm not going to say that I know what that is, again, because it's just something new that I have to think about. I'll segue the whole comment about who's responsible for this. My perspective as a Christian academic is this, and what I'm going to say is not terribly flattering. I think that on the academic level, or pastors have spoken to the lay level, but on the academic level, I think that Christian academics have bought into the myth of academic respectability. That is, if we go get our degrees from universities, and I know lots of people have lots of degrees from lots of universities, Ivy League, Europe, you name it, I can find you somebody that I know that has a degree in something somewhere from one of those places. But the trick is that it's not about who's smart or who's dumb, or who's smarter. It's always about presuppositions and your preconceptions. And mine are very simple. I believe there's a God. Since I believe there's a God, I believe he can actually do something. Because I don't, what's the point? And then I have a list of things that I'm quite sure that he's done, because it's apparent from general revelation, to use a theological term, just from creation, this kind of thing. This isn't accidental. It screams design, as I said before. There are certain presuppositions that go into this, but based on those presuppositions, I'm willing to think along those lines, regardless of what faculty or university scholar or friend that I have who has X, Y, Z degree, regardless of what you may think, because we're back to the old, if you just stop with what's black and white, you lose the sense of wonder, you lose the interest. And quite frankly, it's just terribly dull to me. I'm a big believer in what I call reimagining orthodoxy. And I don't mean changing orthodoxy. What I mean is, I give the church fathers credit for the positions they've staked out. They were incredible intellects, far surpassing anything we're going to see anytime soon. All right? But I want to see if they've rooted it in the text. And as I see that they have, I know what the boundaries are. I know where the A and the B and the C is at. But how the church has articulated getting to those points, I think in many ways is flawed. And it does not answer questions. You said you're a recovering Catholic. Undoubtedly, you had questions. And you probably had a frustrating experience. I know I did. I'm sure I'm not speaking alone here. Of asking questions, of your spiritual authority figures, and they were utterly clueless. I mean, they just had no idea, and if they just, you could be perceived as a threat or whatever. I mean, I've already lost one job in academia because I had either asked too many questions or I asked my students to ask too many questions. So I've been down that road, I know what that's all about. But I just think that we need to be willing to look at God as being, we need to look at that God and what he's produced in Revelation as not being static. Why would we expect the text, if we really believed it, that he gave it to humanity through people for posterity, and he gave us truth? If we really believe this, why would we assume it's so static and so uncreative when he's not? Why would we make that assumption? I just think that we need to, again, everybody operates within boundaries. I mean, science has its own boundaries, at least, again, perceiving where those are. And we need to creatively reimagine how do we get there. I always ask myself this question when I'm doing text work. What does the text allow? What can the text allow? I don't want to violate rules of grammar. I don't want to violate linguistic principles. I don't want to violate principles of semantic analysis. But after all that's done, you're left with options. And sometimes when you get new information like this stuff, instead of just pulling it away from you, you use that language, it just makes you ask different questions. It makes you approach things a little differently and ask the same fundamental question. Well, what could this mean? How could this have worked? How could God have dealt with this or done this or whatever? And then go back to the text and say, hey, does the text allow any of these things? Maybe I just need to sit and think about it a while and just creatively reimagine how this could have been. I wasn't taught. I don't know why I think that. But I just have a firm faith that if God is really who I think he is, then it's about time we take him out of the box. And that doesn't mean destroying orthodoxy. Okay, that means getting out of the box, taking a look at the box, where the boundaries are, and creatively doing theology, doing text learning, so that the box is not only comprehensible and transmittable to the next generations, but it's also intellectually honest and it's defensible. I'd like to chime in here quickly. One of my best friends back in Madison, a member of our church, his PhD is in artificial intelligence. He just took a postdoc in genomics, applying that to the Genome Project. And he and I would both agree that since the image of God is not intelligence, this is not going to take away our humanity with that theology. What I'm concerned about, I know what he's concerned about, and I'm going to follow his work over the next 2 years, regardless of whether we or not. What I've done is that, in one sense, we're mimicking our Creator. We're doing what we're supposed to do in terms of finding out what makes the universe tick and stewarding it. What I'm concerned with is two things: that it will turn into technology, okay, that we will worship what we create more than the Creator. And I'm also concerned about the potential uses of such technology for manipulation. If you've read the Facade, I do some things with nanotech in there as to how that can be used to manipulate our perception of some things that I think are going to be presented to us in the future. And we won't be able to tell what's real in a biological sense and what's artificial. You sense in here about the global conspiracy. This is something I've never really understood. What I can't understand is how Christians, or again, people of faith, can deny the idea of conspiracy. If you really believe that there's intelligent evil, all a conspiracy says is that intelligent evil is capable of manipulating a few people. Or
how about stupid evil?
Yeah, we've seen some of that. Really. But the idea of just manipulating a few people or using people's fallen predilections, selfishness, the idea of just personal agendas and personal gain to cooperate with each other. I mean, to me, it's like a no-brainer. I mean, that happens on small scales every day, and everybody can accept that. It can happen within the family. It can happen within a company, it can happen within a university, or department, or whatever. But all of a sudden, all these little mini conspiracies that everyone in the Christian community would acknowledge exist because of, again, a fallen nature. As soon as you say, well, there's people that are really powerful positions in the world who know each other and have the same agenda, and they want to either have power or money or whatever. As soon as you say that there are key individuals in points of power, positions of authority, who are doing this, and it's like it doesn't work. I mean, to me, that's just a logical disconnect. Theology aside, I don't get it. And I think this is my intuition here. It's not something I can prove. But I've said this on a number of occasions. I think I've said it once already here. I think it's because the believing community seems to be, instead of the people most in tune with the idea of the supernatural, we seem to be the least inclined to actually accept it. Because there's just this almost like this fear
Can you
factor.
say that again?
The people
That was cool.
who should be the most inclined to embrace the idea of the supernatural seem to be the least inclined to accept it. Is that okay? But it's just this impression I get that we like the supernatural when it's God and when it's angels, and they're right here with us and working with us. But evil's over there, somewhere over there with the rapist, with the drug addict, something like that. I mean, some just overt form of violence. Maybe it's just media or Hollywood or something like that, as opposed to an active, malevolent intelligence that just wants to collude with people that are useful to a preconceived agenda. I mean, if we really believe this theologically, what's the stumbling block? I don't get it, but that's my intuition.
I don't think anything is accidental. That's not a declaration of determinism, but I don't think anything just happens accidentally. I do believe in convergences. I think there is free will and determinism at the same time. So that's the bigger look. But to get to your specific question, we tend to cast this religious explosion in a postmodern way where the emphasis is on spirituality, throwing off strictures of traditional religion. But I think we also need to be mindful that part of the religious explosion is fundamentalism of any number of varieties. And so it seems to me you have religion growing at the poles. If you follow my metaphor here, that you've got a bulge over here and a bulge over here, and I do think that issue not only is going to have to be settled between the two ends of the pole. One emphasis on strict, religious, rigorous fundamentalism, uncompromising, militant, so on and so forth, is a natural opponent of the other side, and I think that's going to be part of any sort of resolution on this level. And then if there is some sort of disclosure event, I'm sitting here trying to wonder if I'm more pessimistic than Art Bell. Because every time I go in the show and talk about this, I really try to be optimistic, but he's kind of wearing on me. I don't see. Here's why I'm. Please understand. I'm not saying I'm turning pessimistic about this. I'm always optimistic because I do believe that there's a God. I do believe in providence. I believe that he's ultimately in control and knows what he's doing. On the other hand, though, I just don't see within the church, and I'll just speak for my own, within the evangelical church, I still do not see a willingness to think deeply about a whole lot of things, much less this thing. And I have my own frustrations just as a professor, just trying to get people interested in their own faith on a very simple level. And people just like to feel comfortable. They like to concentrate on family. They like to concentrate on making a living. We have the pressures of our culture, just our lifestyle. And I don't know if it's a time problem. I don't know if it's just a dumbing down education in the school problem. I don't know if it's just a laziness problem, a entertain me, amusing ourselves to death problem. It's probably a convergence of all of those things. So on the one hand, I do think it is headed somewhere. I think it is being guided. I think things will happen. There will be an ultimate resolution to it. But I see a bumpy road because I just don't see a willingness to think too deeply about a whole lot of
I have to do a
things.
follow-up here. While I would never want to underestimate the power of an adult bookstore to create consternation in a society, in a neighborhood, and it does, is it too unreasonable to say that a planet of people who have worldviews defined within certain contexts suddenly is being openly engaged by beings powerful, but yet in a modern context much more difficult to assign as gods, right? And this is happening year after year after year after year, possibly contact as well, abductions. Would that not cause any mass group of people to go for fundamentals? I mean, faced with unknown galactic implications, an unknown future, a paradigm change that makes the Copernican revolution look like a tea party, I'd want to get down to fundamentals, right? I mean, could not the extraterrestrial presence that we've been talking about since 1947 literally be driving a fundamentalist religious revolution?
It's hard to tell how people would react. On one hand, I think there's probably a greater chance of some disclosure event triggering thought about the subject. I think that's inevitable. I mean, what other thing would force you to think about, reality and your belief system? But it's hard to tell how people would react. Would they? Yeah, I think we tend to assume that if this happens, people will just sort of drop all their religious barriers and sort of look at each other and go, oh, we're human, and let's just drop all this other stuff. When what I hear you saying, and I think there is something to it, they might circle the wagons in their own camp and try to deal with things within their own camp and not just automatically or as a reflex move toward a more, for lack of a better term, globalistic outlook. I think that'll happen, but I just don't see it as I don't see it as an either or. I think the reactions will be different. But the one common denominator, though, I do think that some kind of disclosure event would trigger is it would wake people up, I think, sufficiently that at least the majority would begin to start thinking deeply about the things that are really important. Steve?
Yes.
Could I ask Stan Friedman a question?
Of course.
Do you think that there's any possibility that the U.S. could broker their position in some way? In other words, could this thinking be possible among those who know what they know and have some decision-making capability over disclosure, that if they were the first to disclose this, the ET question, that they could somehow broker that into a position of primacy, that we broke this first and then somehow claim that we ought to be essentially put in charge of managing it. What do you think of that?
Well, I think there may be people who think that way. I think it's a phony way to look at things because, again, we're 300 million versus 5.7 billion. 6 billion for the planet. It's growing every day, but that's close enough.
But if we could claim the high ground on back engineering, let's just speak hypothetically that we've had this stuff for so many years and we haven't mastered it, but we've back engineered a lot of things and we're ahead of the game.
We're going to give it to you all, you mean?
No,
You want to let us run the show?
No, it would be used as a rationale to manage the game, and that's it.
May I follow up on that?
I'm afraid we might try to do that, but I don't think it'd work.
I would like to have the chance just to follow up on that, Michael. I do not believe that it would ever be in the interest of the United States government to initiate disclosure on this, at least not as it stands now. unless, I've been thinking about this, unless they were then to try to impose a kind of absolute, total order over everything and just make it out and out open. But I don't know if that would be possible. I think that, you just can't disclose a little bit. So if you disclose, you may think you can disclose on your own terms for the first 5 minutes, but too many questions will arise. And when those questions arise, people are going to start to realize how bad this secrecy has been for so long, and how it basically they've been living in a kind of fantasy world. And I think that there would be enough really angry people, really, really mad, that again, I don't know where this whole thing would end up. So there probably are a couple of people, in the government who think that, oh yeah, we can do this and we'll leverage it into greater power. But I would bet that it would backfire on them.
Steve, if I could just, I don't want to prolong it, but it makes me wonder, Rich, that, and I hate to resort to Hollywood, but it seems like every time you see this sort of secrecy and disclosure presented in the media or in Hollywood, that it sort of gets presented the same way, or at least repetitively. In other words, that the way it's displayed in the media is that the U.S. had good reasons, they had good intentions, they've sort of put themselves in a box, and we're trying to make things right now. And I'm wondering if the broader culture has sort of been conditioned to think in that mode and soften the blow.
Scary thought. We hope not. Any other comments?
Are the extra-biblical post-Christ Gospels, the Gnostic Gospels, well respected by historians and theologians or not, and why? Mike?
Go for it, Mike. It would depend on what you mean by well respected. They're not viewed as fabrications. Certainly, they're not viewed as material that's contrived. So, in that respect, sure, they're well respected. The content is often dramatically different than the canonical Gospels, and so there's going to be some controversy there. I wish we had the question here so I would know where we were going with that question, or if that was sufficient.
Is the questioner here?
The Gnostic Gospels it's really a reference to literature that has the look and feel of a gospel story of the life and teachings of Christ, and specifically in this case from Nag Hammadi in Egypt. These were discovered roughly around the same time as the Dead Sea Scrolls, late 40s, 50s, that kind of thing. And their contents are, as the category would suggest, they're Gnostic. They have a completely different view of Christ in many respects. The role of women, specifically Mary Magdalene, is elevated in the Gnostic Gospels. Probably the most famous, the Gospel of Thomas, really isn't a gospel. It's just a collection of sayings. In other words, it doesn't have like a chronological story of Jesus' life. It's just a collection of sayings. If you've ever looked at the book of Proverbs, it's kind of what the Gospel of Thomas looks like. Jesus said this, and he said this, and he said this. It doesn't have, and he went here, and he did that, and he went here, and he did, and thus and so. So it doesn't have the flavor, really the genre format of a true gospel. But that's sort of a minor point. There's the Gospel of Mary Magdalene. There's the Gospel of Peter. There are accounts, other accounts besides the canonical material. And by canonical, I mean the material that was accepted as inspired or from an apostolic hand is probably a better way to put it, or a close associate of an apostle. Granted, the early church was dealing all the time with literature that bore the name of an apostle or an associate of an apostle. And there were certain procedures that are very non-supernatural, very, very normal, very sort of deliberative and bureaucratic as to how they decided what should be in the canonical collection or not. In terms of theology, if you're just wondering, I find a lot of students are disturbed by the whole matter of canonicity because it seems so human. It seems so arbitrary. It really depends on what your view of providence is. If you really believe in providence, then God didn't take a day off or a week off or a month off when these decisions were being made. In other words, he was in the process. And that has always been the way that theologians have looked at the matter of canonicity, that you can't make any theological decisions about the validity or invalidity of canonicity in the canonical process without a view of providence. If you want to take God out of it, then it's completely arbitrary. If you want to keep God in it, then we have to accept that God supervised the process, was able to influence people to make the right choices, which goes back to, if you're a theist, that's nice, but if you are a theist, you really need to believe that God can actually do something. Otherwise, what's the point? So in terms of respect, though, in the scholarly community, they're not viewed as fabrications in any way. I mean, they're viewed as genuine documents from the time period, 2nd century or so. On the one hand, I mean, there's an element of truth to what David's saying. The Gnostic Gospels certainly have a high view of Christ. That's certainly true. And the Apocryphon of John, referencing Jesus as the Father, is important because that is essentially the Orthodox traditional position. In that, we don't want to say, the Orthodox position would not say that the Son is the Father and the Father is the Son, but they would say they're of equal essence. But in the Gnostic terminology, that the Apocryphon of John, it sounds, in my mind, very close to an affirmation of orthodoxy. The problem is that the material of Gnosticism isn't always the same. The Gnosticism was just like Christianity, of the Orthodox variety. In other words, there were sects, there were different opinions, there were different statements. It wasn't a monolithic, cohesive, agreed upon theology that's always consistent. I mean, even within the books of the New Testament, there are passages that are difficult to reconcile, and the same would be true in Gnostic literature. I think, despite the fact that Jesus has a very high position in Gnostic Gospels, if you do any reading in Gnosticism, you will find that one of the major issues is, was Jesus viewed as an uncreated being? Not necessarily that he was later placed on the level of equality with the Father, but there was a concern that Gnosticism, among other issues, but that Gnosticism sort of took away Christ's status as a pre-existent being of one essence with the Father, and it worked its way out in the Arian debates, which are directly connected with the Council of Nicaea. It is not true, and I will insist upon this. The idea that we had to wait till Nicaea till we had a canon is just not true. The major scholar on this is, if you want to read this, is Roger Beckwith. He's probably the leading scholar on canonicity in the world. And he's produced a number of good works on canonicity, going back to statements of the Church Fathers, and not just the Church Fathers, but in letters that they wrote, and not official church statements, but just correspondences, accounts of their lives, where they will refer to canonical books that we have now in ways that cite them as authoritative. They're very formulaic expressions. Thus says the Lord, thus says the Scriptures, as it is written. It's certainly true, and if you've done any reading here, those of you in the audience, that there was a disagreement, even in the traditional church, as to the number of the books in the canon. For instance, the Catholic Church wants to accept some of the books that the Protestant Church would now call the Apocrypha. So there were disagreements. But those disagreements and those debates were conducted long before Nicaea. In fact, by the time of Polycarp, we have, which is the second century in the 100s, which is considerably before Nicaea, you have lists and statements referring to what should be considered the authoritative books of the New Testament. So to say that that there was no notion of what the New Testament canon was. I realize David didn't make it that broad. Just does not stand up under scrutiny, but I don't know if it really doesn't relate specifically to the whole issue of Gnosticism. The controversy between Gnosticism and Orthodox Christianity is a lot deeper than that. Not just which books get in and that kind of thing. Even the view of women in Gnosticism. There was a recent article that I read shortly before coming here on, I think it was in the collection, there's a book called Feminine Views of Gnosticism. I can't remember who the editor is, but one of the chapters in that book was detailing how certain Gnostic texts had a negative, low view of women. So even that wasn't consistent. And a lot of researchers in alternative history and ancient mysteries and that kind of thing, like Bagent and Lee and Lincoln, seem to portray the New Testament as having this negative view of women, where the Gnostic view was just this wonderfully elevated, enlightened view. It's just not true. That there was difference of opinion within the Gnostic communities, plural, on that issue. But I think we're getting a little far afield with that. I don't see any biblical evidence for a pre-Adamic human race. The angels were certainly there already. To speak of angelic civilization and living on other planets, I don't feel like I can exclude that and dismiss it. I'm not persuaded of it, though, so you can put me in the undecided category. I do agree with Dave about Rahab and Leviathan, essentially interchangeable there in terms of the destruction motif, and Leviathan being the cosmic serpent. In Canaanite literature, Leviathan was also Yam, or sea. We've talked about this before, about how the Milky Way captures all these images, and Lord Nahar, which is river. I do think, I consider it very possible, and the more I think about it, the more I lean toward it, that these episodes do not, even though you have a dragon motif, do not speak of Genesis 3, but speak of something prior to that event. And I don't believe in a gap theory, so I'm not putting it between 1:1 and 1:2. I would put it even before Genesis 1, of some cataclysmic cosmic event. There are just some things that I won't get into now that impress me as possible trajectories that somebody in my field can look at. And I think that when I finally do that and put some concentrated effort into it, I think I'm going to come out pretty close to where Dave's at in that respect. And one last comment on the Gnostic issue, as Dave brought up the question of salvation. That's probably the preexistence of Christ, and maybe even more fundamentally, a difference between the canonical Gospels and the Gnostic Gospels is the way of salvation. In Gnosticism, you don't need a substitutionary bloody atonement by Christ. The way of the path of salvation is knowledge, and the church did object to that. But again, there were gradations of that discussion within the Gnostic communities, again, plural. So just as I don't want to pigeonhole people in the early church, I don't want to pigeonhole people within Gnostic communities either. It's not a monolithic thing. I should add a few things here, since Guy sort of brought me into it. And what I can't quite grasp is, on the one hand, as I look at ufology, you have real nuts and bolts kind of researchers, people who are really, really serious about documentation and trying to understand if these are alien crafts, how do they work, approaching it scientifically. And then on the other side, you have, for lack of a better term, I don't really like the term, but the New Agers. And I think part of the problem for the church is that the two get mixed, and I just don't see any reason that they need to be mixed. In other words, why does an extraterrestrial reality, if there are really ETs, why does that have to be metaphysical? Okay, I know, but so often at these conferences and in the literature, the lines are just blurred. And when you start messing with metaphysics and philosophy and theology, that deters for many Christians to get involved. And if they do get involved, it sort of creates a launching pad of suspicion. You operate from a hermeneutics of suspicion when you try to get involved with this. And I just don't see a necessary connection between the two. I mean, if we are really talking about or whatever, I mean, I just don't see why an extraterrestrial reality has to displace the spiritual, or even, frankly, like you just said, Stephen, to have anything to do with it. And so, on the one hand, I don't get invited to a whole lot of conferences, but
That's gonna change.
I seem to sort of get caught in both worlds, and I don't mind being caught in both worlds, but the question just nags me as to why do we even have this overlap. I think actually if the overlap wasn't there, more Christians would be encouraged, to actually think about it. It just seems, I don't know if I'm expressing it well, but it just seems like such a conundrum to me. I don't know why all these things get mixed of necessity. I mean, we've talked about visions, we've talked about Fatima, we've talked about, all these other things that, I think it was you, David, that said, what we'll get on when Boyd said we'll move on to other subjects. You said like UFOs. That's sort of illustrative of what I'm saying. Now, I'm very willing to tackle the overlap and to discuss it and think about it, but I don't know why it has to be there. And I do agree with Guy that there is a fear factor on the part of what, again, for lack of a better term, secular ufology. Other than this venue and coast to coast, and I admire George Norrie for continuing to have me on, because I have a relationship with Art, and I was on with Barbara Simpson and Ian Punnett and now George, and I think George is, to me, the most courageous, because he's such a fan of Zecharia Sitchin, and he knows that I don't agree with that. But other than him having the integrity to actually have me on and ask me questions about Sitchin when I didn't even submit a single question about him, and that's all he wanted to talk about. There are shows, and if anybody wants to know, I'll give you the names, but there are people who just will not, over my dead body, will you be on my show, because I object to what Zecharia Sitchin says. Like, that's the whole ball of wax. And so I do think there's a fear factor. I understand it in one respect, but I don't get it in another respect. Yes, go ahead.
Any insight from the scripture you're studying on a geographical location of the abyss? And go ahead and repeat the question.
Can I shed any light on a geographical location of the abyss? In the Old Testament world, the gateway to hell was Bashan. It was the place of the serpent. You will see language to that effect. You have to realize what's going on in the Old Testament. Think of your geography now. Here I'll try to do this backwards. You've got the Mediterranean over here, and you've got Palestine here, and then of course you've got Egypt. Palestine was essentially the whipping boy for every major power in the ancient Near East. If it wasn't Egypt, how did you invade Palestine? You didn't cut through the desert, because if you did that, you'd be really stupid to take an army through the desert. What you did is you went up through the Fertile Crescent and down into Palestine. They were always getting invaded from the north, and it became sort of a byword, it actually worked its way into Old Testament prophets typologically, that the ultimate foe they thought would come from the north. Assyria came from the north, Babylon came from the north, and they just came to believe that all of our enemies, all of our significant enemies, are from the north. If you go back before there's a monarchy that gets conquered by major empires, this is where one of the first things that Joshua is told to do He goes into Jericho, and it's strategic. You cut the north from the south. You go into Jericho, you control the center. I mean, contrary to what Yul Brynner says, the God of Israel is a good general. Okay, you remember the Ten Commandments? It's one of my favorite lines from it. He backs him against the sea, and he said, the God of Israel is not a very good general. They don't have any place to go. Joshua goes into the center, and then he goes north. Every place he goes north and south, if you look again, you have Nephilim descendants settled in those regions. And the northern place he tells Joshua to go directly to is in the heart of Bashan. That was viewed as the bad place. Let me just give you one more throwaway verse of what we think is a throwaway verse. When the kingdom split, you had a northern kingdom and a southern kingdom. The center of worship in the northern kingdom, the apostate worship, went back to worshiping calves, just like the golden calf in the Sinai incident. And the prophets made fun of that a lot. They used to call them the bulls of Bashan, because that was the center of cultic, apostate, enemy of God worship. Jesus, when he's on the cross, he's quoting Psalm 22. If you read the whole psalm, there's this phrase in it. When here you have the broken Messiah hanging on the cross, he says, the bulls of Bashan surrounded me. But Jesus wasn't surrounded by a herd of cattle, okay? It's an obvious reference to what's going on demonically, in demonic geography in the Old Testament. But it's something that we just kind of gloss over. That's where it would have been to them. Now it moves to the valley of the Rephaim. In the intertestamental period, that becomes number 2. That becomes the location of Sheol in the intertestamental period, Gehenna, the valley of Gehinnom in Hebrew. But you get both of those.
There's a verse you showed about the Rephaim being buried under the sea,
Mm-hmm.
and I didn't know how to rationalize that.
This you have to be familiar with ancient Near Eastern and I'm including biblical Israelite cosmology here. The world was pictured as flat but round, on top of which was a fixed dome, upon which were the stars. They were fixed. Yahweh's throne was on the top. This is why the earth is his footstool. Okay, and it has windows and pillars and all this stuff. Underneath is Sheol, and it's a watery abyss. So when the reference to the waters is actually being down in Sheol, in the lower parts.
Theoretically, an archaeologist could go where you're saying that region. That's not what problems.
Theoretically, I would think if someone who's excavating in Bashan, I would expect you to find lots of Baal worship there. I would expect you to find perhaps more references to it because Ugart is right next door. They would have had writing and commerce there. I would think if somebody actually dug up Bashan, and I think there's a Hezbollah training camp there now, so don't look for that to happen. I wouldn't be surprised if I were going to look for Nephilim remnants, like a skeleton, that's where I'd go. Okay.
What about a big hole?
A big hole?
The opening to the abyss, I'm saying.
Yeah. Well, I don't think that passages like that I don't think the earth is literally flat and with an abyss underneath it. I think that this was the Hebrew conception of the world, of the cosmos, and we can get into why that was at some other point. But I think it's spoken of in terms of spiritually speaking, because if you look at the globe, the southern, this is why the cosmic abyss is the southern part. I think that's what it's talking about. I think it's talking about a spiritual realm, beings that inhabit that spiritual realm. When they do come to earth, they can take material form. I don't have any problem with that. But I don't think it's a literal place you'd go into, and if you're not careful, you'd fall into. Okay. Another question.
You mentioned that Armageddon would be a battle between man and angels, like the fallen angels.
On both sides.
So does that mean that the unfallen angels will be here also in this battle?
I think the Watchers are released. The Watchers are released in Revelation 9. Again, this is my view. The ones who are free, of course, are obvious participants. They are defeated, according to Isaiah 24. Isaiah 24 said, and they are imprisoned until a later time. So basically, they try to prevent the messianic return. They fail. They're put into prison again this time all of them, including Satan, according to Revelation 20, then that's the only time you have peace and security, okay, for Israel. This is why Gog and Magog, if you actually look up Gog and Magog in the New Testament, it's after the millennium. Okay, the terms are actually there. I think that at that point, Revelation tells us that Satan is released, and there's one more cataclysmic try at it, and it ends real quickly. That's when they're finally destroyed, cast into the lake of fire, which was prepared for the devil and his angels. Okay, that's when you get that language. So at Armageddon, I think they're all there, and I think after the millennium, they're released to their doom. And that's the end of it. Another question? Yes.
Are all and during the conquest, every one of the, what we call ethnic cleansing, are they all tied to this?
What you have, I have a PDF file I can send you on this. Every one of the regions, and in many cases the specific cities, if you look up the Nephilim terms, and you have to do some triangulation, you got to look up all the names for the Nephilim clans, the Amim, the Zamzumim, the Zumim, the Nephilim, the Rephaim. The Hivites might be one. The term actually means serpentine. Nobody really knows much about them. But if you look all them up and the places that they're associated with, and then sort of like plot a grid and then you superimpose it on the places Joshua went, they overlap. Now, I'm not saying that there were only, I don't think there's any way to prove from Scripture that there are only Nephilim clan people living in there, because there are other phrases used of inhabitants of those places like men, very common, generic word for man. So I think in some cases you're probably dealing with a mixed population, but you're probably dealing with concentrations. And even before, if you remember, even before Joshua gets to crossing the Jordan, I think it's God who tells him this. It's either God or the narrator says that even before Joshua went there, God used the Amorites to wipe out these specific populations, and he names them again. So it's you don't even have to be Israel. God is using other people groups to do the same thing, to get rid of them, because they are the seed of the Nachash, the immediate threat at that time in history. After they're gone, the last one you read about, that you can be sure about, is Goliath from Rephaim, is his father.
The fact that they were mixed with could also be seen with Rahab. She would obviously not been alive.
Yeah, I wonder about that. I wonder if it's very obvious that you can have Gentile, what we'll call Gentile conversion in the Old Testament. Now, here's the big if the word Gibborim outside Genesis 6:4 and outside Ezekiel 32, those two passages accepted, if the word Gibborim means or refers to, again, a giant population, then you do have conversion, because there were Gibborim among David's mighty men. Now, there's nothing in the text that makes that clarification for you, so I have to leave it in the realm of speculation, but I wonder about it. Saul, there are some connections with the tribe of Benjamin with this too, and Saul was from Benjamin, and he stood head and shoulders above everyone else. You just can't be conclusive. It's suggestive, but that's about all you can say. Are we done? Okay. Another question? Yes.
What is the relationship to angels and the stars?
They were. What is
What
the relation between angels and the stars? Go back to our ancient Near Eastern cosmology. The belief was that you had this fixed dome upon which the stars are attached. It was viewed that way because ancient people could see the stars move. Now they're thinking the stars are the ones moving, when we know it's actually the Earth. Okay, but because they moved, they thought they were alive. Okay. So you had one of two views develop in the various cultures. Either the thing that I'm looking at in the heavens, that little dot, is a divine being, but I just can't make out the features, or the constellations are divine beings fit together, or they inhabit those places. You actually get a variety of conceptions as to what is going on here. And so in the ancient world, you often see in texts, it's just everywhere. Egypt's really huge in this area. Mesopotamia. You know, other than my own fond wish and, and guess, you know, I don't know. Now Dave, and Dave is following Jewish tradition here about divine beings inhabiting certain planets prior to the creation and all that stuff. That's a very old belief. My answer to that is we ain't going to know until we go there, until we come up with some just proof positive, point blank, that this is there. And if that happens, as Dave would tell you, you know, we have a very old tradition for that too, that can be traced right back to the Bible again. There's very few things in this field that the biblical text has not covered before. In fact, I'd be hard-pressed to come up with one, to be honest with you. In the back.
Sorry, can I just throw in 2 cents worth with
Sure.
regard to the stars and the angels? Patrick Heron here.
Right.
Originally, we're told that the God numbered and named the stars. And throughout a lot of the Old Testament and in the book of Revelation, it refers to the stars of God. And the stars is a figure of speech for angels. A star fell from heaven. Where it talks in Revelation 9 about a star fell with the key to the bottomless pit. It was obviously a star. Lucifer means the bright morning star, which was Venus. And then it talks about Jesus Christ in the future being the bright morning star. Many of the gods, small g, the Nephilim of prior to the flood, are named after stars and planets, i.e. Jupiter, Zeus, Poseidon, Pluto, Apollo, etc., etc. So I think these guys were actually named after stars and had stars named after them, and vice versa.
Yeah.
Of course, a lot of that would have been lost now. And this ties in with the... sorry to be butting in your
No, go right ahead.
your talk here, Mike. But this ties in, of course, a lot with the zodiac and the planisphere of the stars from a biblical astronomy point of view, where you have Virgo as the Virgin, Leo is Leo the Lion, who's Jesus Christ, Draco is the dragon, who's the dragon, and Serpent is also in the constellation of the planisphere of the stars, who's the serpent, and of course the dragon, who's the serpent, is the devil and Satan. It says twice in Revelation. So there's a lot of duplication between stars. I think personally that they're actually named after planets and stars.
Yeah,
and there's talks about seven planets, seven angels of the church, 7 stars. There's a lot of work, I think, to be done. And that's
Right, and that passage too is another association between, if you caught his reference there, the 7 stars of the 7 angels of the churches. It's another reference and re-reference back to Christians as being the holy ones, the stars of God, that kind of thing. The only difficulty you have in terms of the biblical text is, and you'll get people who will oppose this notion that Patrick's talking about and I've been talking about, and that's just in the text. There was this identification. I mean, in my mind, you just can't deny it because it's just there and it's in other civilizations. But there are passages where the sun, moon, and stars, the same phrase, the host of heaven, is just meteorological or astronomical or that kind of thing. And so people will latch onto those and say, see, it has nothing to do with it. You know, take things in context. This is why I took you through all those verses in Deuteronomy. They were considered gods. Okay, I didn't just have those up there, you know, just to like fill another slide. Okay, you can trace it right through Deuteronomy. Yes.
Be very careful here because I may offend, but I'm going to try not to do. I was here last year, saw the presentations last year, and since then I've read an interesting book, Is Jehovah MIT, and I've been listening to some of this talk in reference to this book, so kind of seeing things from a different perspective. I'm not saying I believe in this perspective yet, I'm just playing devil's advocate here a little bit. You mentioned that Jesus Christ was referred to as the morning star, and that Lucifer was referred to as the star of morning, and vice versa. And I find that very interesting because the morning stars, the dog star Sirius, there's connections with the Illuminati and the dog star Sirius. Syrian ETs, et cetera, et cetera. When you really kind of look at it, basically what I'm seeing is that from Jehovah down, all the way to Christ and all the way, they're all basically based on your concept. We're seeing that all of these are fallen angels provide us straight. Our whole religions are based on this fallen angel concept that were brought to us by these ETs that pose themselves as gods.
It's easy. Okay, I'm going to say this at the risk of me offending, and I'm not offended, and I don't think you will be either. But that is, you see it that way because that's Gnosticism. Okay, you cannot find a text that calls Jehovah a star. He is, quote, this is why Lucifer wanted to be, quote, above the stars of God. The reason Jesus is the morning star replacing Lucifer is that there will come a point in time when Jesus is Lord of Sheol, Lord of the dead, and he will raise everything at the last day. It's not that he is a Satan figure. It is a displacement metaphor. Now, but that goes back to the whole Jehovah thing. He was above the stars of God. I had Nehemiah up here. There's another verse in Psalm 33 where it says specifically that Jehovah created the stars. He, by definition, is above them. Now, if we throw religion out the window for a moment, the reason I don't think Yahweh is an ET is because if we're thinking of ETs as like everybody on the planet thinks of ETs, we have to consider them created beings in some sense. You could say, well, they might have created our universe, but by definition, you have to have a singularity point. We know this from physics, the Big Bang, the whole bit. You've got to have some creator that exists outside of creation. That creator, which the Bible describes as being in that slot, as it were, is Yahweh. So by definition, just philosophically, you can't have Yahweh be an extraterrestrial in an Israelite worldview. In a Gnostic worldview, you can, again, but you don't have any text to hang it on. And I'm not saying Gnostics don't bother with the text. That would be unfair. But I think in this case, it's a doctrine in search of a text. Okay, at least as far as the biblical material. There was somebody. Okay, go ahead. I want to make sure we don't miss somebody that hasn't asked a question.
I think you alluded a little bit to the spiritual depth of being potential candidates.
Potential what?
Candidates for demons after the flood.
Yeah, that's Enoch.
The original sons of God themselves that bred with that fall.
Those are the ones who are in prison.
Okay.
Every tradition has, even outside Judaism, the Greek version, Tartarus, they all get slammed and put in the slammer, as it were.
Right. My understanding is that those that were present at the flood were in prison at that time, but yet afterwards, Nephilim appeared in the days afterwards. I would assume that other sons of God had to come down and breed those Nephilim if the original bodies were destroyed in the deluge. So if they were,
it's an interesting
where are
question.
they? Where would they? Where would you think they might be post-deluge?
There's two things to be said about this. One is that according to Enoch, there's no biblical material for this part of your question, but according to Enoch, you have the offspring, the Nephilim, when they're killed, the physical part dies. The immaterial part is referred to by Enoch as a watcher. Now you could extrapolate from that and say, if they're a watcher, and 4 chapters later Enoch says that they can take any form they wish, you can extrapolate from that, from Enoch 15 through 1 Enoch 15 through 17 and 19 verse 1. You put that together and you essentially have the new generation of watchers able to do what the old ones did. Okay. Now the other thing to be said for that is in Genesis 6:4 when it says there were Nephilim in the earth in those days and after. The grammar there is good. I get to bore you with Hebrew grammar. It's an imperfect verb following a perfect verb that is prefixed by a vav, and it's the frequentative use. Isn't that exciting? It really should be translated, there were Nephilim on the earth in those days whenever the sons of God cohabited with human women. That implies, it's always dangerous to base a doctrine on a conjunction, but it implies that it's ongoing. Okay? the place to go for that is that you won't see many modern commentators because they just don't care. They're into things that really are boring. The International Critical Commentary by Skinner on Genesis will deal with that, and the Word Biblical Commentary deals with it a little bit. It's by Wenham, first volume. But you have two ways. You have two ways to approach the issue. Either the second generation can duplicate the feats of the first, or you have this whenever continuing aspect. By the way, if you really believe in you don't even have to believe in the biblical worldview to get this, but if we have post-flood literature from Egypt and Mesopotamia and the Hittites and whoever, we have post-flood literature referring to post-flood events where kingship is brought down from heaven and the gods cohabit and give us the pharaohs, give us the kings. That's all post-flood. Okay? So those texts do not necessarily, some of it's pre-flood, you got to read the text. But you actually have texts, Bible included, that say that this was happening after the flood. Now, I think that is extra biblical proof for these implicit suggestions I'm giving you as far as why doesn't the Old Testament say more about that? I think it's implied in the syntax, the verbal syntax there, but Enoch is a little more, he fleshes it out a little bit more. No pun intended. Anybody else? I know you don't have a question. You're like, oh, okay. Oh, you're just telling me time's up.
We're on break almost, so Mike never quits. But the two seeds, kind of you were talking earlier, it raised the question that Rhonda Kessler's already written down for the panel. Eve and the serpent, did she or didn't she? Did they get it on? That's the question.
Well, if you
your view.
If you only quote half the verse like Lawrence Gardner does, then they did. If you quote the whole verse, no, they didn't. So we can. There's actually a. Well, I wonder if I have that one. I'll look for it. I may have my old PowerPoint things here. If I can find it, I'll put it. If I can't, I'll write it out for you. Okay. Yes. Go ahead. A what? You mean by supporting? Am I in favor of it? Or? Well, I think there are these divine beings, and they too take feminine aspects, and one of them is Lilith. So, I mean, Lilith shows up in the Old Testament. So, yeah, there is a Lilith, but beyond that, I don't quite know what you're asking. Oh, that.
Sexually transcendent breeding.
No, I don't. The reason the rabbis came up with that is very understandable. I'm not going to say it's logical because I don't think it is. Yeah, they're trying to figure out how two beings in a perfect environment who'd never known evil could just screw up so badly. And so they have to. What they do is they take the third character in the story, and they create these relationships. I mean, there's nothing in the text that suggests this. But, to be kind to the rabbis, they're trying to figure out a very difficult theological question that in this day and age, for those who don't want to just put things in the text, it really comes down to this whole predestination free will struggle. Because, it's something that if God really does know everything, he would have known this was going to happen. So why did he make it happen in the first place? Why did he put, you get all these questions. And part of that issue for the rabbis was solved in their mind by putting in extra characters into the story. That's a long way of saying I value the biblical text more than the rabbis, because the rabbis were just, let me be nice to them, amazingly creative. I mean, they come up with things that this guy had to be on drugs. I mean, there's just no other way. It's unbelievable what they do with some things. Yes.
Yeah, I too have questions about the literal interpretation of the fall of man, because I think there is a level of allegory involved, symbolism. Because if you just follow the literal interpretation, you still got problems, because supposedly Adam and Eve were perfect.
If you restrict it to the
well, no, let me explain.
Okay.
Because they were born perfect with the immortal soul and mortal body, but yet they were forbidden to eat from the tree of knowledge of good and evil. But then they did, if they didn't have, this is the bottom line, if they didn't have a knowledge of good and evil, how can they be accountable for doing evil? That's a book.
Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead and repeat the question.
If Adam and Eve did not have the knowledge of good and evil, and then they broke the rules, how can they be held accountable for doing something evil if they didn't have the knowledge?
Because by definition, they were told what not to do, and they disobeyed. Now, granted, Eve was deceived. Eve, by the way, is not the heavy in the New Testament. You know, and I say this as a slam against some Gnostics, because they just try to make this caricature out of Christianity that like Eve is just this awful person. We got to hate women because of, yeah, you know, some rabbis did that. Some early church fathers did that. I know that. You know, like wake up and look at the text. You know, Paul says very clearly that Eve was deceived, but Adam sinned knowingly. And this is the reason why you have to have, Christ is called the second Adam because he has to undo the effects of the first one. He's not called the second Eve. Okay, there's a reason for that. So, getting off that little hobby horse, I think that's the reason that they were given a command, they had every faculty that they needed to obey the command, and they still didn't do it. And Adam, of course, sins willfully.
Adam sinned knowingly. But he sinned by eating the tree from the tree of knowledge of good and evil. So did he have the knowledge or didn't? No.
Well, your question dealt with accountability.
Right.
Now, when he knows, I mean, how could he not know that, oh, that thing that Eve has in her hand with a bite out of it, you know, and now he knows in the conversation where she gets that. I mean, he knows that is what they were not supposed to do. Now, he's never experienced being in a state of rebellion. There's intellect. I mean, I can know what it means to murder someone. Okay, I don't have any experiential knowledge of that. Okay, and I think that's not the whole answer, but it's part of it. There's someone in the back who wants to jump in here.
Along those lines is that, and you were hitting on it, Mike, is that what that's talking about? It isn't talking about an intellectual knowledge of good and evil. It was talking about an experiential, because through in a host of places throughout Scripture, both in the Tanakh as well as the New Testament, is that to know meant to experience. To know a woman meant to experience her. To know God means to experience God. It's not just that intellectual knowledge. So they didn't have any, quote, knowledge of good or evil until they experienced evil. Then they knew what it was. It's like, I know not to put my hand on a hot plate intellectually, but I know not to put my hand on a hot plate when I do it.
So would you not conclude they had not experienced good?
No, they had
Because
experience.
if they hadn't had the knowledge of good and evil, and knowledge is experience, and they had not experienced good.
Yeah.
So I would
but
say they
good
did
was
experience
good was
it.
just the standard in the kingdom of God. But when they experienced evil, they discerned the difference between good and evil. They experienced and they came to the understanding, this is good and this is evil. But at that particular point in time, it was too late.
Yeah, I think if they've experienced the presence of God, they've experienced the blessing of God. So I would say they've experienced good. That doesn't mean they've experienced evil, because and this is part of the rabbi's dilemma. It's like, well, why would they do that? You know, something, and their conclusion. You know, look at you have a limited number of conclusions. God was behind them doing this. Okay, you know, he's pushing them along. God just says, do what you want for the next 2 seconds, you know. Or we have to introduce a third character to make them do it, to seduce them to do it. So it's a classic issue, and so I won't be too hard on the rabbis for that, yes.
Well, this also brings us back to the question of free will. If you don't know any better, if you don't know what the choices are, then you don't have free will. You have only that which is given ordained by you to do. So in other words, God created Adam and Eve according to your story, but he didn't give them free will. He just said, don't eat this tree and do this. And so technically, so-called Lucifer, gives them the opportunity to know the difference between good and evil, and therefore gave them free will. But I believe that God gave us free will. If God made us into perfection and then allowed this temptation to occur, I personally would think that He would want that to occur. In order for us to have free will, we have to know good and evil.
Do you have free will now?
We have free will now.
Have you ever murdered?
No.
So in that category, you're not free. So I think you're still confusing the choice with the ability to make the choice, and sort of inverting them. But I follow your logic, and I understand it, and that's part of the difficulty with the bigger issue. In other words, what I'm getting at is we have to decide on what our definition of free will is. Theologians do this all the time. If I can choose to do good, and I know intellectually what it would mean to not do good, but if I only choose good, if I have a really good track record, I've never failed, I'm still free because I'm still making that choice. So there you would have a definition of free will that doesn't involve doing darkness. It just involves knowing that. And we're not going to solve this in the next 2 or 3 minutes. But you're right to bring up the free will issue, because that, in current parlance, that's where it goes. It doesn't go with injecting third characters into it. Yes, sir.
We all have missions on earth. Adam did. The reason Adam ate the apple or whatever was to get the knowledge of good and evil. He wanted to have this because he was afraid he was not going to be able to be successful in accomplishing his mission on earth. This is why fear, or Satan, told him, if you'll eat this thing, you'll have knowledge of good and evil. You will have sinned. He did it in order to accomplish his purpose. He was afraid he couldn't do this. Fear caused him to do it. Satan is fear.
Okay, so we still have a seduction, a temptation. The temptation. I mean, he chooses because the temptation is directly related, but it's related. I would tend to agree. Believe it or not,
We agree with
Yeah, one more question.
There's a problem in a lot of the definitions of good and evil that we use. Remember that Genesis was written by a Hebrew monk before the Greco-Roman notions of arbitrary good and evil. When they're saying the knowledge of good or evil in that fruit, they're not necessarily saying the atom itself was evil. Well, the atom itself was good. It's subjective moral. It's God specifically told them all these trees, all these things, and they eat them. Except that it's not a good or evil. It's just a commandment not to disobey.
That doesn't make morality subjective, but it makes the object
itself right. So it's not that they were doing evil; they were in perfect wrong. It was the same as if they woke up in the morning and rolled over.
Well, if your definition, when you talk about ethics and morality, there has to be a reason why X thing or X act is considered good or not good, good or evil. Okay, in the biblical story, that reason is the commandment of God. So by definition, if you disobey the commandment of God, you have committed evil. But I agree with you that the fruit was in the piece of vegetation or whatever it is incidental.
Was whether or not they could have known evil without eating that fruit. So it wouldn't have mattered if they didn't know good or evil. It wouldn't have been an identifiable source until.
Yeah. No, I think that's what the gentleman in the back was saying too. I think he'd agree with you.
Are you saying that you do not think the tree in and of itself, or the knowledge of good and evil, was, you're saying that's just like a neutral thing?
He's talking about the piece of fruit. There was nothing, or whatever it was.
It was gaining knowledge. They gained knowledge, and with knowledge is accountability.
I think he's talking about the literal object itself.
The disobedience was not right, but the gaining of knowledge isn't.
Getting more knowledge is possible.
Yeah, it's a consequence.
It's the same consequence.
Don't you think God did not want them to have that knowledge?
I think God wanted them to have that knowledge, but by His own methods, His own time. I mean, what happens is, in essence, what happens is when the Nakash says, you know, you eat of the fruit, you'll become as, most translations say, God. I would actually prefer you become as gods, knowing good and evil. The grammar is ambiguous there, but that's just my preference. But that's all it is. I think the point of that is that now, post-eating, post-disobeying, now we are like the gods of the council. We know what it is to choose well and to not choose well, because one of them, the Nakash standing right in front of him, has already experienced rebellion. And the rest of the council understands that and knows it because they've seen it happen. They may not have participated, or they may have, depending on how you take Revelation 12, where you put that back. But the Nakash was correct, okay, in that statement. This will make you like us. Okay? But I think the whole intent of being created as God's imager and as His sons and daughters, you know, male and female, equal there, was that eventually I do want you to be like the gods, like the other Elohim I've created. I want you to be right here with them, with us. This is why in Daniel you get the Son of Man with the holy ones, with people. That's what the kingdom is. Okay, this is why in Revelation Jesus says, to him that overcomes, I will set you over the nations. Christians displace the fallen divine beings who are now in control of the other nations. This is why Paul says, don't you get it? Why are you fighting over this ridiculous lawsuit in 1 Corinthians 6? Don't you know that you will judge angels? Think of the council. Adonai, Hashem, Yahweh, the lower Elohim, the angels. You're in the mid-slot. You are over the angels. You're over the nations that they rule currently. I mean, you have what I call council motifs running through both testaments. And the whole point, this is why Revelation ends in Eden. Look at the description. The whole intent from the very beginning was to make humanity, to give them this knowledge that only the council had, that only the gods had, under the headship of Yahweh. This was the plan. And the fall, yeah, screws it up, but actually delays it and complicates it. Okay, so that the Nakash substitutes the method, substitutes the timing, and the whole seduction of gnosis, as it is said in the New Testament and the Old, for that matter, because Gnosticism has Jewish roots. The whole competition, the whole point of the combat here is that on one hand, God says, you're going to be my sons. I've already called you my sons. How many times must I use this language for you to get it? Okay, this is your destiny. And the Nakash says, do you want it now? Don't wait for God to make up His mind. Don't follow what God's doing over here. I'll give it to you now. You'll be like one of us. I'm the dispenser of knowledge. I will give you this status. I will be like the Most High. I will call the shots. Okay, this is what Gnosticism at its core is. This is why Yahweh is set against the Nakash. And when I say Gnosticism, I'm talking about later developments of Gnosticism. But the whole seduction is this. Man is tempted to take his rightful place before it was time to get it, and through the right means. Someone else, the Nakash, puts himself in the place of the planner and the executor of the plan. That was the problem in the garden. And that is the seduction from here on out through humanity. The Watchers do the same thing. You want to know what makes the universe tick? Oh, we'll tell you. All you need to do... Oh, sure. Why do you think Satan says to Jesus, hey, I'll give you all the kingdoms of the earth? Why can he say that? Deuteronomy 32. Okay? I mean, you have these threads just running through both testaments, and the issue is seducing mankind with the knowledge that if he just would wake up, if he would just blink a little bit, instead of being mesmerized by the Nakash, he would, oh, I'm going to get that already. Can you offer me something I'm not going to get? Okay, but instead of doing that, it's I want it now. Okay, I'm going to give authority to you. You're going to be my ruler. You're going to be my God. It's the same old thing with the Watchers, throughout the both testaments when it comes to this issue of the divine sonship of the body of Christ, as opposed to the rulers and the powers and the principalities and all these other guys. Yes.
So are you sent against the idea of any position of Angels and Watchers to use the information gathering or not?
You're talking about now?
Well, you were saying that the problem was when they accepted the offer from Watcher, Angel, with Nakash and Cheddar.
I think if you read the contactee literature, it's the same message you'll get in Genesis 3. We will tell you what runs the cosmos. We will tell you what makes it tick. We will give you knowledge that you cannot otherwise have.
What of Solomon?
Well, Solomon is Solomon. Where does Solomon get his wisdom? He gets it from God. He asks, right.
The demons, so the Watchers, Angel, Cheddar. To his message.
Right. Are you referring to the Testament of Solomon, the pseudepigraphical book?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, it's
No, certainly that is a. I don't want to say, how can I say this? I don't want to say I value the Old Testament testimony over that, because it's entirely conceivable to me that what the Testament of Solomon describes, Solomon could have done, because he does go after other gods a whole lot of times.
he's using in the book of Solomon as the Old Testament book.
I would say when he commands them to a purpose consistent with the revealed will of God, I don't have a problem with that.
So if it was the will of God, the man should be judging the angels and the Watchers of mankind. He would have hard knowledge of the people, which would mean that
Well,
technically still.
are we talking about Solomon, or are we talking about Adam and Eve? Because you don't have. But I don't think the parallel is a very good parallel, because you have Solomon. Solomon is in a different state post fall, and you're trying to apply this to a pre-fall question. During fall moment, I don't see Adam using. Well, on the one hand, he doesn't get the chance, because he's in a state of corruption, post bite. Okay. Prior to that, there's no hint in any of the traditions, biblical or otherwise, that I'm familiar with, that Adam intended. So, yeah, I'll go along with you, but I'm going to turn the tables on you, buddy. Okay. I don't. No, what I'm saying is that even at the moment, I don't see him having the motive of Solomon in those passages. Now, I don't know the Testament of Solomon as well as I know canonical literature. I mean, I don't know if Solomon performs righteously in every episode or not. Okay. Yeah. I think that the book Testament of Solomon, by the way, is an intertestamental book. It's grouped in the pseudepigrapha. I do think there is something pre-Christian to this idea of spiritual warfare, of commanding the spirits. And again, if Solomon is being portrayed in such a manner where he's exercising his authority as God's son, singular, the king was God's son. I mean, that's in the Old Testament. Which it always baffles me why Jewish people can't conceive of this idea of God having a son or God's son on earth. It's right, Psalm 45. Yeah, and most of the, this is going to sound like a slam, but it's just my experience. My experience is limited. But most of the Jewish people I know have never read anything past the Torah. I've actually had a Jewish person come up to me and ask after some session at university, ask me who Adam was. This is the person who goes to synagogue. Who's Adam? I'm like, hello? I mean, it's one of the most unbelievable questions I've ever been asked. So I don't think they'd have much familiarity with it to get beyond the point you're describing. Sure.
Put up my thoughts on the Gnostic versus the Christian view of the fall.
Well, you should say Gnostic versus Orthodox, because they're both sects of Christianity.
Yeah. Well, the biblical view is that mankind was created immortal, an immortal soul and an immortal body. Right, Adam and Eve.
I would agree with that. There are people on the Orthodox side who don't think Adam was immortal. I do.
Well, I think that's what Jesus says.
I agree.
I think Adam had what I call contingent immortality. But anyway, go ahead.
Okay, the Gnostic worldview, which really draws heavily from pagan mythology, would be that Adam and Eve were originally created, I guess, in a mortal, perhaps in an immortal body, but without a soul. And
right, the soul had to be infused.
The soul was infused through Lucifer, the knowledge of good and evil. So yes, no. So the Gnostic view is that the fall is not a fall; it's actually a leap forward.
Gnosticism is not a consistent tradition, so there are lots of different views of this within Gnosticism.
That's what Helena Blavatsky writes clearly.
Well, that's her. If you go back to read Nag Hammadi, it's going to be Sophia who infuses the divine spark of divinity. That's where that phrase comes from. Right. My point is, it's not Lucifer. If you're going to go reference some of the major Nag Hammadi texts.
Okay. Yeah.
I mean, Lucifer's the bringer of knowledge, but humanity already has this spark of divinity in them in Gnosticism, and that's what Lucifer says that Jehovah doesn't want you to know.
Right.
So they already have it. So it's not, he's not bringing it. They already have it. But are you finished or?
What you're saying, Terry, is just a very important point you brought up, or a very important question you brought up, and that is that how is man to prepare for the choice of going to God, or receiving the call, or whatever you want to call it, without having the experience of that choice and having the experience of the fall? In other words, I agree with the Gnostics on the idea that Lucifer, the bringer of knowledge, had to give us knowledge of good and evil for us to no longer be in innocence or naivety, in order for us to experience good and evil, so that we could then, by our own choice, choose God.
Right. How are we going to choose God unless we know what evil is?
Exactly.
Right.
Exactly. I believe that there is God, that this God is an unseen God, and that this power of choice was his most important gift.
Yeah, I'll illustrate it this way.
All of this quote unquote evil was actually part of the plan.
I think you're underestimating the human faculties given at creation. If you and I were dating, would I need to repulse you and repel you and make you hate me before I could know that I wanted to love you? Do I need that?
Maybe it wasn't his choice. Maybe it was
Okay. Well, what?
Is the fall. The fall was that, okay, well, we understand what love is, but what is opposite of that?
Right. Go back to the illustration. What I'm suggesting is you don't necessarily need an opposite, or to have experienced an opposite. For instance, if you cause these feelings to well up within me, I like those feelings. Pardon the redundancy, but those feelings feel good. Okay? I like that, and I want more of that. In other words, there's that appetite there for the good, and I keep going to it. I think it would be not only illogical, but almost aberrant or unhuman to say, for me to stop one day and say, in order for me to really feel this feeling again or better, I need to either hate this person or I need to make them hate me so that they can choose me like I want to choose them. It's a convoluted way of approaching what would make you gravitate towards something. And this only takes part of, in my mind, it only addresses one part of your question. The other part is more fundamental, and frankly, it does get thrown around a lot. even within conservative theological circles, there will be those who will say, and I don't necessarily have a problem with it, but I can't tell you that I'm there. But there will be those who will say that God, well, I'll use the O word, ordained this all from the beginning. Now, if I get to heaven and I find out that God ordained the fall, I will not ask for a rain check. Okay, I will live with that. And look at God and think, well, you're probably a whole lot smarter than I am, and in some way, in your mind, this fits, this is what was best to have happen, this is the way things needed to work. Okay, just because I can't grasp that doesn't mean that that is not the case. All right? Now, there are some who would take this position, and they'll use passages like Jesus Christ being slain from before the foundation of the world. In other words, the necessity of the second person of the Trinity having to die on behalf of humanity and being willing to do that, that was all before any of this was ever created. And so, in my mind, it's a very sound textual place to go for that idea. Now, it brings up sticky theological questions, which is why people either A, try to explain those verses in some other way, or B, come up with a new position and have to define or redefine terms where those verses will fit. And that let's put it this way, it sounds simpler. It sounds a lot simpler. And by the same logic, and I'm not saying that I'm a universalist either. By the same logic, though, some people are driven to universalism because if Christ is truly going to be the complete, that's an important term, but the complete, utter Redeemer of all humanity. In other words, if Satan really is going to be conclusively, utterly defeated, then all humans will be saved. Because if you lose one, Satan wins at that point. Now, there are problems with that. But some people who are on one end of the, let's just call it one end of the predestination loop or spectrum, will sort of end up on the other end because they want to see what in their minds is a complete victory. And then the question becomes can God achieve a complete victory in his mind that doesn't involve universalism? Okay,
I don't think there's an issue of victory because I don't think that there is an absolute evil. That we create our own quote-unquote evil, opposite of life, in order to just explain this down.
What time is it? Okay.
Last question. One more.
Go ahead.
I'd like to share 2 points. One, the second commandment says, don't have any fixed ideas. I think about that. If you don't have any
fixed ideas.
That's right. That's what that commandment says. Look it up in there.
Thou shalt have no other gods before me.
No fixed ideas.
Well, I don't know what language you're reading.
Think about fixed. Look it up into that. Look up graven images. Graven means.
Are you talking about graven images?
Engraved, fixed in stone, in concrete, in gold, or whatever. Fixed. Okay? Images are nothing more than ideas, concepts, considerations.
But in the Old, it doesn't work in the Old Testament because the same term is used dozens, maybe hundreds of times for a thing that was constructed by hand and destroyed by hand. It doesn't just mean an idea.
Fixed ideas is what the second commandment says. It's mentioned 47 times in Well,
if you walked up to an Israelite and you pointed to an idol and you said, "What is that?" He'd say, "That's my fixed idea."
Well, that's not
It's a belief system. It's a fixed idea. Whether it's in words, in the Bible, or in a cow that's made of gold.
It is not
or in religion.
I'm not buying it. I'm not buying it.
Oh, that's.
You think about it, you pray about it, you look up in the dictionary, the word, the definition of graven, and look up images in the dictionary.
You're applying. We're not
trying to logic.
Listen.
Simplicity.
Simplicity is not taking one meaning of a dictionary from 10 and saying that one means all of them. That is self-styled exegesis.
He's already said in the first commandment, don't be
Because you're dealing with real people in a real world, with using real languages. When you speak, you don't mean one thing every time you use a particular word. Your language, your communication has to be set in context. It's the same thing with what you write. What he's suggesting is that I'm going to go to the dictionary and I can find, and I'm sure you can, I can find that this Hebrew word can mean idea or fixed idea or whatever. Therefore, ergo, that means that I'm going to take that meaning to all these other passages. Okay, I just think that that's what's wrong with it. What's wrong with it is if you filled out your IRS form like that, you know and they know that what you put down here, you mean certain things by it. You're hoping, at least I would think you'd hope, that they don't get that thing and attribute an entirely different meaning to it. When you go in and get a haircut, you say, I want this, 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 and this. If your barber takes a meaning of the words you used and puts other meanings, other legitimate meanings in other contexts to what you just told them to do to your head, you might get ticked. Okay, if I go in and I go to my urologist and I say, hey, you know, I want a treatment for, or I want a vasectomy. Okay, if I get a sex change operation, I'm going to be ticked. Okay, communication works in context. We are not free, whether in verbal communication or written communication, to take any word from a semantic range, any of a semantic range for any particular word and assign it to wherever we choose. Language, reality, doesn't work that way. And that's what he's doing.
You are presently being victimized by the very thing that God said not to do. You have fixed ideas in this area, and you can't stand it.
I'm a resident of reality.
Don't have fixed ideas, then God gives fixed commandments. What's your
Okay,
fixed idea?
is this your wife? When you say, honey, I love you. Okay, do you hope that she thinks that you love her like a hot dog, or that you love her that you'd give your life for it? Okay, so in other words, you'd give your life for a hot dog. Okay, it doesn't make any sense.
Why would you say, have no God before me, with the first commandment, then come in behind it and say, well, don't you worship any graven images now?
I think it's called clarity. I mean, you're correct in the one sense that behind this idol, this thing that you could kick or whatever, you know, it's solid. I don't think that the Israelite or the pagan was dumb enough to make this and say, okay, you made me. All right, now I think what Isaiah is talking about in those passages is they could conceptually say this thing represents a greater being, reality in your parlance. I think that's perfectly legitimate, that the graven image is not just the block of wood or stone. It represents a greater reality. And the reason I think you have two commands is that God's hitting both bases. Don't worship any other gods, and don't make any of these, because if you make these, that's going to be indicative. You're either going to be tempted to worship it and look at it and think of them, or that's just an indication of where you're already at. So I think it's a point of clarity and trying to be all-encompassing. This is what you do not do. God's redundant all the time. Hebrew parallelism. He's redundant on every page of the Psalms.
Are you intending to go to lunch right now?
If we have lunch, I don't. What was that about time?
Yeah. Well, God is eternal, so time really has no meaning.
Get the PowerPoint.
I would answer that question as saying no. I don't see any evidence for biological entities in the way that it's been defined. I don't have any problem with it Theologically, I just don't see any evidence. Are we supposed to be disagreeable here?
Oh, sure.
Okay.
Well, be yourself. Let's put
I'm
it that
going
way.
to try to be really disagreeable. I don't. Norm brought up the issue of the atonement and the death of Christ. To me, that's not an argument against accepting the idea, because I don't see the creation as falling. I see the creation as being victimized by the fall. In other words, there's a distinction, I think, between humanity, Adam, who falls, sins knowingly, incurs moral guilt before God, and hence needs to be redeemed. Everything around him, including the creation, suffers as a result of what he did. So if E.T. is part of the created universe, and he would have to be, because by definition there can be only one creator, he isn't necessarily morally guilty. In other words, he may not need atonement. He may be completely incidental and peripheral as part of the creation. I don't know if that's the case. Like I said, I don't see any evidence for actual biological life. But if somebody shows that someday, if it surfaces, I don't feel troubled theologically about it.
But Mike, do you even care to reply or have any thoughts on the matter?
What passage are you thinking of in regard to the soul connected to the mother's line?
Well, I'm not thinking of any.
Ask that into the mic.
I asked Bill what passage he's thinking of in regard to the soul being in the mother's line. The reason I asked that is because I can't think of any. Of course, I don't have everything memorized. But despite that difference, I mean, Scripture just isn't clear as to the origin of the soul. Matrilineal descent in Jewishness or Jewish thought is different than biological descent. But all that aside, I don't think I would say anything different than Bill would. I don't. It made me think of the passage in Revelation where it's very clear that that hell, the lake of fire, was designed for, quote, the devil and his angels. By implication, that doesn't say that humans weren't supposed to be destined there, but that is the implicit principle that this was not something designed for humanity to end up at that place. And if that's the case, then if you have human beings, whether they've been tampered with or not, that's not the intended destiny, which suggests to me that they can be redeemed. I think the other thing we need to remember too is even with some of the Nephilim races in the Old Testament, there are places where those populations are referred to as men, okay, Adam, humankind. So there doesn't seem to be this reclassification just because you are the product of this, even in the Old Testament. But nevertheless, you were viewed, and the reality was they were the enemies of Israel. That wasn't a fabricated charge. It wasn't a trumped up kind of situation. They were direct lineal descent. You had very clearly giants, the various clans still on the earth, still obviously perpetuating their own species. And so I think that there's not, we can't quite equate that time with this time. In my mind, I'll just throw this out. I don't know if I've ever said this, but I'm not denying that there could be genuine genetic tampering with what goes on in what we call the abduction experience. I'm of the opinion, though, again, not ruling that out because of Genesis 6, I'm of the opinion, though, that a lot of that stuff that abductees report is for no other purpose than erecting a paradigm in the minds of the world, in the minds of people, as a psychological preparation to the idea that there will be a divine man, a divine hybrid, i.e. the Antichrist. So I think a lot of it is just to restructure the paradigm. But again, I'm not excluding the possibility that it could be. But I'd like to see and meet and have somebody, genetically verified that they're different. Until I see that, I think it's more psychological warfare and deliberate ritual traumatization of people for the specific purpose of altering the worldview. That's my own inclination.
Great answer, Stan.
I don't think Enoch is canonical. I don't really know that the question matters. Canonicity is one of those doctrines that I think, I won't say gets misunderstood by the church, but I think it bothers people. Because on the surface it looks like, well, a bunch of guys got together and voted, what's going to be in and out of the Bible. Now, yeah, there was a process that people had to decide that. But if you enter into that thought with the second thought that, God must have just taken a day off when that happened, then the idea of canonicity in the process, I guess would bother you. But if you believe that God doesn't take days off, okay, that he was in the process, then the canon is the canon, as it has been decided. Okay, and so I don't see any need to consider Enoch canonical. I think it's a valuable resource. I look at this a little bit differently because when you when you're in text as much as I have to be, you see a lot of things going on. Just because Jude quotes Enoch doesn't make Enoch canonical. By the way, Jude isn't the only one that quotes Enoch in the New Testament. There are a number of allusions to Enoch in the Gospels and other places. But the Old Testament quotes the Baal cycle. The Old Testament quotes, Egyptian wisdom literature. Paul quotes Menander and other secular Greek poets. We're not going to make them canonical just because they quoted. A quotation from a source does not endorse that source as canonical. That portion is valuable under the guidance of the Holy Spirit to make the point, whatever the point is that the New Testament or Old Testament author is making. But it's all peripheral, really, to the issue. We don't need to extend the doctrine of canonicity to material that's quoted. It's just unnecessary, and it doesn't. We don't have to do that to get value out of it and to admit the truth. A lot of people don't know that Enoch is quoted in some of these other materials. I can show you places in the Psalms where the Baal cycle is quoted word for word. And whole lines, not just like 2 or 3 words. I mean, just passages. And the prophets do this a lot, and they have a specific reason for doing it. I mean, this isn't Israelite religion class, so we don't need to get into that. But it happens. But I'm not going to say the Baal cycle's inspired. I mean, good grief. Have you ever read the Baal cycle? It's just a place you don't want to go, and we don't have to go. And so on the one hand, it's an important question because it's data. It's right there. Okay, just point blank, this kind of quotation stuff happens. On the other hand, I think we need to understand why authors would do this. We sort of take the humanity away from the New Testament and Old Testament authorship. In some cases, I think they were people. Their styles are obviously different, as Jim alluded to. It's not it's a 100% divine process, and it's a 100% human process. There's no parsing of percentages when it comes to inspiration. I think we need to admit the obvious, but not extrapolate to the unnecessary. So that's my
good. I was going to say
quick comment. Just for clarification, I actually like Jim's idea because not because I think it's connected to Enoch. This idea that if the church had accepted this, then where would the difficulty be? I like it because I believe in providence. That you get important church figures like Augustine, and there are historical reasons and personal reasons why Augustine ragged on the book of Enoch, and specifically a literal view of Genesis 6. We won't get into that, but it's very transparent if you read his life story and his relationship to the Manichees who revered the book of Enoch. But I think in God's providence, it is kind of interesting that you get this hiatus from this, I think, important theological point. And so I think it's really worth considering as a providential sort of way to look at the paradigm as it's played out.
And it's underlined. Question for Mike Heiser. Are there female sons of God or daughters of God, or are experiences with female angels more likely a deception or illusion? Yeah, that was mine. Thanks. No, I'm kidding.
The short answer is, yeah, I don't have any problem with. I use the phrase divine beings because that sort of encompasses everything. I don't have any problem with them taking physical female form. It's true that you don't get. There's one possible exception, but it's very vague, and so I don't think it really contributes to the discussion. There's really no evidence in the Hebrew Bible for an angel or an Elohim, lesser Elohim, appearing in female form. That doesn't happen. They're always masculine. But that said, it's also clear, I think, both within the canon and outside the canon, that these entities can take various forms, possibly any form they wish, if you look at what Enoch says. And so to say, well, they can take every form except the female is just kind of, odd. And you do get, various reports through the Middle Ages. Augustine, Augustine's, of course, 5th century. They had long, drawn-out theological debates on, okay, when you have sex with a female demon, is that a violation of the scriptural command against bestiality because that's not human? I mean, they had these long, drawn-out theological discussions. Okay, well, right, so this is something very ancient that important figures in church history. I mean, you go back and read Augustine and Aquinas, and they're having these discussions. So I think it would be kind of absurd to say that this can't be.
I just wanted to ask Michael one quick question because I think it's an important one to ask. I agree with what everybody's been saying. I just wonder one thing. In your experience and understanding of the scriptures, is there a place for a good female angel?
Ooh.
In other words, obviously there is not an appearance that I know of a good female angel in the Old Testament, but do you think if someone had a female angelic visitation, that maybe even what was said was more or less scriptural, would that necessarily be outruled by the scriptures or what?
And would it be a sin if I married her?
The second part, yes. So, no, I believe in guardian angels, and I think they can take female form, so I don't have any problem with that. I don't know why. We just seem to have this vacuum. I mean, the Hebrew word for angel, the Hebrew word for spirit, don't occur in that Zephaniah passage, which is why people have just kind of hemmed and hawed over it. But it's kind of incidental because you do have guardian angels. At least I think that's what Matthew's talking about, and I take seriously guardian angel reports. You do have obviously deities in pagan pantheons that take female form. I mean, it's pretty obvious, but it's a good question. I've never actually been asked that question, but I think I'd put it in the guardian angel category.
But having said that, and in closing, the New Testament, Jesus said about the feminist movement there, I mean, he did recognize women for their value, but he was departing from the historic Jewish position, was he not, Michael?
Yeah, I think the New Testament... this is one of my favorite bugaboos with the Gnostic crowd. Okay. I think the New Testament gets far less recognition for elevating just a general view of women.
Yeah.
It's portrayed as though Gnosticism has the corner on the correct treatment of women. Well, I would challenge you to actually read the Gnostic texts. Yes. I mean, there you can't be saved unless you become a man. I mean, how's that a high view of women? I mean, give me a break. But you read this in the literature, the Da Vinci Code, and the books that's based on. This idea that the evil, Christian church, just treading, at every opportunity over women, and then the glorious enlightened Gnostics that, how wonderful they were. It's just it's ridiculous. So I tend to agree that that the Bible does have lots of patriarchal stuff in it, because again, it's also a human book. It's 100% divine, 100% human. It's a product of its own times. It's a Mediterranean-centered document. Again, I don't see any point in denying the obvious, but I think God's perfectly willing to work with people where they are, and that includes the writers. He doesn't endorse a lot of what goes on in the Old Testament, but it's reported because that's what it was.
Right.
Are you asking, is it conceivable that some other eschatological approach could be correct, and that the rapture idea will be used against the church? Is that your question? Okay. I'm actually concerned about that because it's certainly true that the reason there's an eschatological debate is because there's a debate. I mean, there are passages that can be taken 2, 3, 4 ways. There are ambiguities in the text at even fundamental eschatological levels. Let me give you an example and then tell you why I'm concerned about this. Very, very basic, simple things like the 70th week of Daniel being equated with the tribulation. There's no verse that actually says that. Now, it's logical because it's 7 and 7. And so everybody assumes that, but there's no verse that actually says that. Let me ask you, just throw out the question, and I think you'll answer it in a certain way because it's a fairly straightforward question. If you had somebody come up to you and say, "Hey, I've been reading the Gospels, and over here in Matthew, Jesus says X, Y, Z, and over here in Mark, it's obviously the same event, and it's not exactly what's over in Matthew. I think that one of them has to be wrong." What would you say? Now, chances are we'd probably say something like, well, we need to harmonize the synoptic gospels. We need to put all the things together to get the fuller picture. And that's very easy to adopt that approach. I think it's the right approach. Well, the very idea of a rapture is in part based upon differences in descriptions of, we'll say, a coming. Well, this passage over here in 1 Thessalonians 5 can't refer to what's going on in 1 Thessalonians 4 or Matthew or whatever, because the details over here don't precisely match the details over here. And so the dispensational approach to Scripture, which is where the rapture idea flourishes, says that must mean that there are two events. In other words, there, in prophecy, instead of harmonizing, which is what we would all do in the Gospels, then we keep the passages apart, and we come up with a rapture and a second coming. Now, it may be that we're supposed to keep them apart, and we have a rapture and a second coming, but it may be that we're supposed to harmonize. I mean, there are just fundamental methodological things like that, like those two examples, that have made for debate. And so it's entirely possible that another scenario is the right position. For instance, if you harmonize the eschatological comings, what that does in practical terms is it eliminates the rapture, and you have a second coming. Now let's just pick that one for example. Let's say that turns out to be the correct position. If that's the case, then if you take a scenario like Jim has been talking about, and I don't know if I've told you this, but I've been wondering about the same thing for the last couple of years.
Sequel material, huh?
Yeah. Well, don't go there. I'm not.
I'm sorry.
Make a great novel.
Please, I don't want to give away the store here.
Part 2.
But if that's the case, then what you're left with is a rapture that, let's say, raptures the New Agers and whoever, and Christians are left behind. And then if like 7 years later or some within the 7-year window, you're not gone, what I think would happen was you'd have a situation exactly like you have in Babel in Ezekiel's day. You're sitting by the river Kivar, and you're saying, we're the sons of God. We're the promised children of God. What are we doing here? I mean, our butts are in Babylon. We're slaves. Did God forsake us? It's exactly what they were asking. And they were, the people of God. The righteous with the unrighteous suffered the effect of the Babylonian invasion. And it's you can point to church history and talk about Christian suffering and all that kind of stuff, but I want to keep it in a biblical perspective. If that's the case, my concern is that a scenario like that could just crush the will of the church. And that's if I can think of it, I'm sure that they've already thought of that and run it through the mill and done the war games that would be associated with that in the head. So I'm concerned about it. I don't think any of these alien scenarios or whatever would turn out to happen, if anything. I don't think that legitimizes or illegitimizes any particular eschatological view. But if we're on the same radar, I'm concerned about that could be used against the church.
We're going to move on.
I'm going to backtrack a little bit, but let's kind of go in reverse. The Daniel passage is interesting. If you got to understand how I sift things. I'm an academic. Please forgive me. And so I'm always checking these things, not only just against academic material and the original languages and whatnot. That's just part of it, because I'm always trying to think of what would a possible scenario or system be that would make this all of this stuff that we talk about, that would make this coherent to someone who is outside the realm of anybody interested in Scripture, the atheist, the agnostic, whatever, the scientist, on and on goes the list. To me, the Scripture describes a deception that's comprehensive. It's not just aimed at people with certain worldviews. I'm also I really think that bloodline mythology is important. So with those three things in mind, I'll just hit on a few of these. The Daniel passage is interesting because the verb in 243, they shall mingle themselves with the seed of men. It's the ordinary word that you would use for getting married. It's used elsewhere in the Old Testament. There's nothing unusual about that word. What's unusual is the phrase the seed of men. That in and of itself, it's almost humorous to me to go and look at what scholars have written and commentators have written about that, because no matter what view they take, they always wind up with explaining the passage with human-to-human marriages. It's Babylonian this, it's the Roman that, whatever. And they just seem to say, well, the phrase is really strange, but we're just essentially going to ignore it. So you get that a lot. Verse 44, now, if the emphasis was on the singular and what Norm was saying, kingdom, and then you get the plural they, logically speaking of those who are part of the kingdom. So you get this they shall mingle themselves with the seed of men, they shall not cleave one to another, even as iron is not mixed with clay. And the next verse says, in the days of these kings. So you could infer, and again, I'm not making a hard and fast argument here. You could infer that kings are the result of this mingling. But in the days of these kings, or again separate kingdoms that are combined, shall the God of heaven set up a kingdom, which shall never be destroyed, and the kingdom shall not be left to other people, but it shall break in pieces and consume all these kingdoms, and it shall stand forever. Now, that's an obvious description of the kingdom of God. If we take, and as most dispensational commentators would take the four nations here, you wind up with some sort of amalgamated Roman Empire. My eschatology, part of it is I'm what would be called a progressive dispensationalist. In other words, I see the kingdom as already having been inaugurated and started at the time of Christ with the first advent. I don't see an ultimate fulfillment until the millennium. I do believe in a literal 1,000-year millennium. If that's the case, then the kingdom was begun in the days of Rome, coinciding with the first advent. And part of my talk yesterday, Revelation 12, Satan, I saw the star, I saw Satan fall from heaven. That happens at the beginning of Jesus' ministry. That is the signal point as to when the kingdom is announced. if that's the case, then you could have this. If this is a demonic, if there's a demonic idea behind all this, that would be the point when you would have this essential, kickstarting of the disembodied spirits beginning this program all the way back to the first coming, because now there's this the parallel seed, the parallel lines, the parallel kingdoms, operating in tandem, one against the other. So just a thought to throw in there. Along with that, I think that the bloodline idea is important. I hope you two realize that even though your ultimate conclusion right now is incompatible, okay, if you're right, that does not invalidate his bloodline idea,
And vice
or
versa.
the rationale, because I think what I view the essential core of what we think of as modern ufology. I believe it is essentially rehashed Gnosticism. And bloodlines are very important in Gnosticism, especially when you get to Jesus' bloodline mythology. And I for that reason, I tend to, I'm intrigued by anything that I hear that creates a coherent, rational explanation for why bloodlines would be important. They've always been important. You've always had, quote, bloodline mythology in the European history and prior to that, and so on and so forth. So I just want to make that point that even though your ultimate conclusion right now is incompatible, the idea certainly is not, and actually works together, because if the point is bloodlines, you don't need a physical seed to create a bloodline deception. And what I mean by that is, if the point of what we call bloodlines in all the abduction stuff is to plant and, quote, prove, evidence the idea that there is now essentially a new humanity with us that is divine and human. Divine being, it's from them. It's from the God, our space brothers out there. The people that we thought were our gods in primitive days, which are actually extraterrestrial. All you need is the idea. And I agree with that, because if the person that you're talking about, we already have this with indigo children.
I was just going to
Okay,
bring that up.
this is the beginning
Yep.
of this idea of a new humanity being here. It doesn't have to be true. I hope you realize that. None of this has to be true. It just has to be put forth. There has to be a precedent, a rationale that can be brought to bear on it.
Explain why they're indigo children.
Well, it just is the higher intelligence. They're more spiritually sensitive.
Laura reads out
Yeah,
indigo.
yeah. It's the whole. Basically, you could match a lot of the contactee literature with this vision of the new humanity against what's said about indigo children, and you have this now. Nobody's going to be able to empirically test that, or they may not even care. If they do, they can say, "Oh, it's junk DNA. We don't know what it's for. We don't know where it came from. We don't know why it's here." If you're an evolutionist, we don't know why it evolved that way or whatever. And it's very, very convenient to say, well, this must travel generationally. This must have something to do with bloodlines, and there we go. I mean, you have this connecting of the dots in that way. So I don't want you guys to get hung up on, and I don't think you are, on who's like ultimately right in the question, because I think the larger point is the paradigm. Sure. It's the paradigm that we always have to think about.